Thanks for joining us for leading equity work in your organization. My name is Andrew Robinson. I'm the program manager at the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. Really excited to see a great turnout here today for this session. So thanks for taking the time out of your day to come and join in this conversation. And thanks to those who took the time to fill out the survey. We'll be sharing some of the results from that in a little bit, and we're continuing to collect those. So if you haven't done that already, if you could do that afterwards, I'll make sure I send a link in the follow-up so you can do that. I'm going to ask, because we have a pretty big group, over or close to 60 people, that folks stay muted for this session, and that we use the chat to send questions to the panelists. If you could take a moment to change your name so that we can see both your name and your organization, and your preferred pronouns is always helpful as well. It's nice to be able to see who else is in the room. And I'm going to take questions throughout, and I'll be able to cover some of those during the panel itself, and others we're going to hold off until a Q&A session towards the end. So if we don't get to your question right away, it doesn't mean that we've forgotten you, but we're gonna try to get to everything by the end of the session. And then the last sort of logistical piece I'll mention is that I will send around an evaluation form, an end of session survey towards the end of this through the chat, so you all can take a minute to give us some feedback on this session. And then there'll be a follow-up email that will include resources, a link to the video that we're taking now, and other follow-up pieces, which I can go over in more detail towards the end. Before we get into the panel, I wanted to turn things over to our executive director, Christine Nardi, for some opening remarks.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon again, everyone. Really delighted to be partnering with everyone on the panel to host today's workshop, and I want to thank all of you out there in the Zoom nonprofit community for making the time for today's conversation. I am going to share some of the results from the survey you all took in a minute, but first I wanted to give you just a bit of context for CNE's own equity work in progress, which led us to this programming, and will help you understand why we're so excited to be part of this particular conversation today. So while we'd offered a bit of equity programming throughout the years, it wasn't really a core part of our strategy until after the summer of 2017, when we worked with board and staff to create 3 strategic goals that we still focus on. Our first goal is really an internal goal. We understood that we needed first and foremost to figure out how to center equity at CNE, and that is very much a work in progress, as we'll talk more about today. And then we had 2 other goals that were our external goals. The first was to support our nonprofits to become more equity centered, and the second was to provide direct support to leaders of color within the nonprofit sector, to help make sure that they had the CNE kind of capacity building support that they needed to be as effective as possible in their own roles. So 3 years later, I can tell you that we've made some good progress, I think, on our internal work, but we are still very much a work in progress on all 3 of those strategic goals. What we know, and what you'll hear today, I expect, is that it really takes a full-bodied organizational commitment, and it's not work that you finish, but rather it becomes part of the, if you're continually doing the work, it becomes part of the DNA of you as an organization. And at CNE, we definitely don't have all the answers. What we're really committed to is being authentic in our work and in supporting and learning from you, which is part of the reason why the survey results that have been coming in resonated so much for us as a team. And so Ian, I'll ask you to pop up the survey results on the screen so everybody can start to see them. And if you can advance to the first slide. So what you can see there is we've gotten about half of you responding to the survey around progress towards your equity related goals, and 50% of you who have responded are kind of less than a year into the work, and 50% are more than a year into the work. So that tells us that we've got lots of opportunity for conversation today. And the next slide. You may recall, for those of you who took the survey, that we asked you specifically about some steps that have been identified by the Annie E. Casey Foundation for kind of centering race equity in your work. And we asked if you'd had the opportunity to work on any of those different steps. And so those, as a reminder to those who took the survey and those who haven't yet, those were the steps that we were just sort of taking a pulse check on from the people who are part of the conversation today. So next slide. And this is what you reported as your progress towards the goals. At most, only 50% have begun working on any single goal. 2 organizations have begun working on all 7. And those with more than 5 years of experience still had goals that they hadn't yet started. So again, the theme really is it's a work in progress. It takes long-term commitment. It's a journey, not a destination. And what we're looking forward in today's conversation with this amazing group of panelists that have come together is the opportunity to share what's working, to share challenges, and also to hear from you as a broader group about what you've found that's worked as you've started to take steps to center equity within your organizations. All right, so here's a couple barriers that were identified to implementing change. They won't be a surprise to anyone on the Zoom today. One of the challenges is really making sure that you're doing the work not just with your staff and not just in your programming, but also giving time and space to help and support your boards to be able to do this work. There's a barrier in many cases of really trying to identify where to get started and how to do the work in a meaningful way for your particular organization, because all organizations are different. And so that's part of our thinking about this program and some upcoming program is to help support nonprofits who are trying to think meaningfully and tangibly about how to do this work. And then a lack of buy-in from funders, because one of the things that we do know is this work costs money and it requires investment. And so in order to do that, we as organizations have to figure out how to make those investments. And one of the things that we do to raise money in our organizations is to develop partnerships with funders. And so continued education, not just of boards of directors, but also funders around what the work is, the process that you'd like to engage in, and building the opportunity to have those ongoing conversations. So next slide. These are just some quick quotes from people who took the survey, articulating what some of their challenges have been in thinking about how to start or how to continue the work. So here's an example of feeling like you're just one in a crowd, and how do you develop buy-in across your organization in order to be able to figure out even what the next steps might be. Next slide. Lack of capacity. That's something that nonprofits are challenged by generally, right? Figuring out how to develop enough capacity to achieve your strategy. And this is no different. Making sure that you're resourcing the work appropriately is one of the big questions. And understanding when you can do the work internally and when you need external support. And that's something that we'll be talking about today. Next slide. A challenge in who your organization relates to and the authentic organic relationships that you've developed within the clients that you serve, as well as the communities that you're working in, is one of the things that was identified as a barrier or a challenge. And then we don't know what to do, and because of that, and because it feels large and hard to grapple with, we don't know how to do it, and there's some discomfort around taking steps and being able to be in conversation around the work of equity. And then there's the obvious of not only are we trying to achieve our impact in the community as nonprofits, we are also trying to pivot greatly to be responsive in COVID, and doing this equity work is something that, if you haven't started it yet, can seem like another large project that you need to bring into the organization. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk today about how to break down those barriers in order to work forward in this work, regardless of where you are and regardless of what capacity challenges you're facing, because this really is the core and the crux of all of our work moving forward. All right, so just a reminder, we thank you to those who've been able to respond to the survey and encourage those who haven't to respond so that we can continue to understand what's going on in our nonprofit community and continue to help each other in figuring out what our next steps might be. So this panel, as I mentioned, is the first in line of a series of programs and resources that we're going to be offering aimed at supporting nonprofits as they build out more systemic approaches to organizational change. And the next offering that I think Andrew will talk about in more detail at the end of the panel is building a race equity culture within your organization. And so today, the goal is to start the conversation and really start to think about what the framework for the work. And then we'll have a next offering, a next program about building a race equity culture in your organization with one of today's panelists, Ebony Walden. And she's going to lead organizations through equity in the centers framework, which is a racial equity framework for organizational change. So keep an eye on that. That's going to take place on December 3rd from 9 to 12 p.m. And Andrew is going to share the link with you all. We have also continued to curate kind of resources around what it means to do this work. Again, we don't have all of the answers, but we're investing staff time and energy and our resources in order to serve up resources that we think could be helpful to the nonprofit community wherever you sit, understanding that you need to decide how to do this work within your own organization. There's no one path or one right way necessarily. So we'll be sharing newly curated resources for nonprofits seeking to invest in DEI work. And in early 2021, we are going to be offering a program specifically targeted for board members to educate and support board members in understanding why it's important for all organizations to do the work, not just organizations that are traditionally social justice organizations, and how to go about positioning yourself to do that work in the context of being a board member or in board leadership. So look for that coming up. And lastly, I just want to highlight that the United Way, in partnership with the UVA Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, will be offering a small number of grants for organizations that want to learn more about the Inclusive Excellence Framework, another framework for doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And that's the framework that's being instituted at UVA and also supported by the Governor's Office for implementation with businesses and nonprofits and public sector organizations across the state. So that's a tool really to build an equity culture within your organization. It's another framework. And so stay tuned for more information on that. Again, we're looking forward to today's panel. I want to thank you all, and I'm going to hand it back to Andrew to introduce the speakers and get us started.
Thanks, Christine. I really appreciate that. So today our goal is I think threefold. One is to look at different areas in which organizations need to be focused on examining policies and practices around equity and sort of responding to some of those challenges. Thinking deeper about the investment, which Christine mentioned, so getting buy-in from the organization and finding the financial and relational resources. And then thirdly, thinking about how to bring in outside support in the form of consultants or maybe advisors to help carry this movement forward. So today's panel reflects those goals. We have a mix of staff, folks with board experience, and consultants. So we have with us today Aline Carey, who is currently with Cultivate Charlottesville and is the former board chair of City Schoolyard Garden, who was pivotal in a lot of the work that they've done at that organization. Matthew Gibson, the executive director of Virginia Humanities. Andrea Mayfield at the Women's Initiative, who has been heading up a lot of the diversity work that's been happening with her organization. And she's actually been working in coordination with another of our panelists, Ebony Walden, who's a consultant based in Richmond, but with lots of experience of Charlottesville as well, doing social convening, social engagement work, community engagement work, and DEI work. And then finally, another Richmond-based consultant who does work throughout the state, Jonathan Zur, who is the CEO at Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, who we've worked both with Jonathan and Ebony on different aspects of CNE programming and consulting, and have really valued their insights. So really happy to have this mix of experience here today. And so thank you to the panelists for joining us. And I'm going to start with our first question, and maybe Andrea, if you don't mind starting us off with this one. I'm just wondering what led your organization to dig into equity work. Oh,
I muted to start. So the Women's Initiative was frankly founded in the work of creating equitable access to mental health services. But we've certainly had moments where along the way we've chosen to dig deeper in response to August 12th, obviously, but since in terms of responding during the Fields trial. Most recently, as a result of the pandemic, we've been increasingly mindful about slowing down to consider all aspects of clients' needs, but also the needs of staff in terms of equity for Black and Latinx staff members that are in need of particular supports at this time.
great. And I'll just pass that same question on to Matthew, if that's all right.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. I think in many ways, August 11th and 12th in 2017 was certainly a pivotal moment for us. I became the executive director about a month before those 2 days, and I think that moment sort of caused us to think, who had Virginia Humanities been, and who were we now as an organization? As a statewide cultural organization, we'd done certainly good work over 45 years, amplifying inclusive histories, supporting cultural documentation and preservation efforts. But internally, we were very much, and continue to be, white at the top and in most positions of leadership. And I think in general, I think white people like myself probably assumed that our Black and brown colleagues, experienced our work environment the ways that we were. And I think externally, we had to ask ourselves, were there better and more inclusive and equitable ways to actually position how we were working with and supporting cultural organizations and communities across the Commonwealth? So really the question became, who did we want to be? Who were we going to be? And so I think through a strategic planning process that we began in 2018, and with very important influence from staff, especially our younger staff, we identified a few things, especially in goals, that we needed to better reflect in our board and staff the makeup of the Commonwealth we serve, to evaluate current and to create new policies and procedures that actually would facilitate staff recruitment and retention of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And then create an inclusive working environment internally so that everyone felt welcomed when they actually walked through the door. And so then through this process and through the strategic planning process, we actually created an inclusion and equity staff committee to actually implement needed changes in our hiring and recruitment processes, and also to advise on how do we make this physical environment called Virginia Humanities into a space that's welcoming and inclusive.
Thanks. And Aline, would you mind telling us about your organization?
Sure. So Cultivate Charlottesville, if that sounds new to you, it's because we officially launched earlier in 2020, in April of 2020, and we're made up of 3 programs that you might be familiar with: City Schoolyard Garden, as Andrew mentioned, Urban Agriculture Collective, and the Food Justice Network. So that's just a little bit of background on how we got from City Schoolyard Garden to where we are right now. And when we hired our first executive director, when City Schoolyard Garden hired the first executive director of this organization, who is still here now, Jeanette Abbey Nader, she said, if you hire me, my vision for this organization is to take it from a social service organization to a social justice organization. And here's what that means and what that involves. And I hope you hire me, but if you do, this is where we're going with it. And so that led what was an organization focused on experiential garden learning for students to be where we are right now. So it's been years and years. That's 7 or 8 years that we've been working on building equity into the center of what we do in a social justice kind of way and looking at everything through that lens. As Christine mentioned earlier, journey, not a destination, doing so many things over the years, but really hiring the executive director was what instigated that change.
Thanks for sharing. And Jonathan, would you mind talking a little bit about what got you started in this line of work?
Certainly, yeah. I'm grateful to have the chance to chat with these wonderful colleagues today. So the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, where I work, is a nonprofit organization founded back in 1935. So an 85-year record of working with schools, with businesses, and with communities across the Commonwealth of Virginia to foster inclusion and equity. That doesn't mean that our organization has always gotten it right. And I think there have been bumps and growing pains internally and externally along the way that I'm happy to share as it's helpful during this conversation. But I do think that one of the things that's an opportunity in this conversation is to think both about how we're trying to do the work of equity internally as a nonprofit ourselves, but also are engaged by institutions across Virginia to support them in their work to advance more equitable and inclusive outcomes. For me personally, I have been doing this work with VCIC for almost 15 years now. And it really, for me, is a passion, not a 9-to-5 job. I think any of us who do this work really come with a deep commitment. Mine draws from family history. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Draws from some deep personal relationships and learning that I've had the honor of being able to do throughout my life. And so I think it has manifested in my work with VCIC, but I think whether I was with this organization or elsewhere, this would be the work that I'd be committed to doing.
Thanks. And Ebony, do you mind filling us in a bit about yourself?
Sure. My background is actually in urban planning and development. And I'll take you back to like when my interest in these things started, about the intersection of race and space. I moved to Long Island when I was about 8. And then which is pretty much a black and brown kind of enclave in Long Island, but there was a white community north of me and a white community south of me. And when you drove into those spaces, the place looked distinctly different. So the lawns were bigger, the houses were bigger, the robes were paid better. They had more grocery stores, less corner stores. Everything about those communities were different than mine just by crossing the tracks, both literally and figuratively. And so that got me interested in this intersection of race and space and how the places we live really are racialized, right? And that has everything to do with race and economics. And so I got really interested in why is that so? And that was so in every community I've lived in, whether it's suburban or urban places in various places around the country. And so in doing urban planning work, I don't think that you can talk about land use, development, housing, and all the other things that impact like housing and health and social services without talking about the history of racial discrimination, both from federal and local policies. And so I always, in my work, ran up against that history, and people really didn't know. We knew, right, of Vinegar Hill, and in Richmond, it's Jackson Ward, it's ubiquitous in every US community. So we didn't know ways to talk about that. And so I was like, in order to do this work well and correctly of community change in general, we need to have the language and tools to talk about race and the ways it impacts our communities, our organizations, and literally is embedded in our physical environment. Unless we get that right and understand it, we cannot transform our communities and our organizations. So that's what kind of got me going and is largely my focus in my work.
Thanks, and I'll stick with you, Ebony, for a second, and just wanted to check in about some of the challenges that you've seen organizations face in this work, and maybe even you could start if things come to mind about some places, some things that organizations could have in place before reaching out to an outside consultant.
Yeah, so listening to the responses to the survey you all sent out, I think those are dead on. I think people generally don't know where to start, particularly if they're white-led organizations and most of their staff is white. I think folks are like, we know we need to do something. We know this is an issue. We know we should be talking about it, but we have no idea how to talk about it, largely because our white population in this country has not been racialized. So to talk about race is literally a foreign concept, right? And so Black and brown people and communities are racialized. So at least at some level, they have the language and experience, even if it's awkward to talk about it. So I think it's where to start, and the fear of getting it wrong, as was noted there, is huge, right? And so folks feel really hand-tied, not having the language to talk about it, and not necessarily having or feeling that they have the staff capacity to even move into the conversation. And then also the framework. So there are so many frameworks out there. You might drown yourself in looking for a framework, looking for tools, and sometimes there's so much information that you might get lost in it. And so I think folks get lost in that and feel like not really sure how to move forward, where to go, who to talk to. So I actually think that, that's like the paralysis of like so much. It's too many choices. And what's helpful for me is that organizations really move past that and figure out, okay, where are we right now, right? So diversity is the mix, and that's representation, inclusion of like what kind of work environment isn't welcoming, and the equity is slightly more complicated. It's a mix of those, and also looking at outcomes in the community. I think it'd just be helpful if organizations had conversations with themselves, whether that's board or staff, and said, where are we now? What is the work, even if they don't know, that we think we might want to do? And like, where do we want to go? Because sometimes they call consultants and kind of want us to analyze for them where they are, but you know more about your organization than I can ever know, right? And organizations, I've worked with the Women's Initiative for the better part of this year, and organizations that have done some level of work are much more easy to work with. And not that I won't work with others, but just they've done they've done their own work. And so I can work with them to build their capacity and partner when they're stuck, as opposed to, I cannot run your whole initiative, and you're looking for a consultant to do that. You're probably starting from a different mindset, because you should be building your capacity to do this work in a sustainable way. And so there's so many, pick one of them, pick one of the guides, read it, start your staff reading, and get just a little bit under your belt, and then say, we're stuck at something. We need training on this. We need coaching on this. We need somebody to come in from an outside facilitation perspective to help us dialogue about this. That's a lot easier, right? I work with organizations on all spectrums, so it's not about whether I work with them or not, but it's a lot easier if they've done a little bit of work. And I also want to empower like all white organizations. I don't feel like they think they can talk about equity without people of color in the room. And I wanted to dispel that myth. There's so much work you can do, even if it's just processing your own whiteness, right? And I actually think that is sort of the work that white folks need to start doing and can do amongst themselves at any point, whether personally or as a group. And so I think that they think of like, there's no people of color in the room, we can't talk about this. And I think that is absolutely not true. There's so much work you can do just in reading and thinking about how race has impacted your own life and experience. And starting with those things, I think will move folks into a better position to call consultants in to help them either think of a strategy or with discrete tasks that you can't do yourself.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful. Jonathan, is there anything that you'd like to add from your experience to build on that?
I think what Ebony said is right on. I think there are a few things. One is that if you're reaching out in the aftermath of a crisis, you need to evaluate why you weren't caring about prioritizing this beforehand. That's not a statement of critique. I think there are a lot of organizations, I'm sure Ebony has experienced this, that in the last few months, we've gotten a bunch of calls at BCIC from folks saying, we want to do something. They don't know what they want to do, but they feel like they need to do something. And so I think at that point, it's really important to figure out what your baseline is. There's not a one size fits all, but there are, I think, some best practices to be able to learn from that. Building a foundation of trust becomes really important. So sometimes if it's an organization where folks on the staff team can't even talk to one another about these issues, we're not going to talk about doing equity, substantive equity, community-centered work if we don't have the internal foundation. So sometimes we're doing climate assessments, sometimes we're helping institutions just think about their staff culture or staff and board culture. There might be some foundational vocabulary to make sure that when people are saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, they mean the same things. We joke a lot in our organization that I can tell when a college or university started their diversity initiative by what the name of the office is. If it's the Office of Minority Affairs versus Multicultural Affairs versus diversity and inclusion. Now there's more of sort of a inclusive excellence, social justice. They have these names that don't necessarily reflect the actual work that they're doing. In some cases, they're choosing the label of the moment without the backing. So we really need to make sure that we're talking about the same things when we're using vocabulary. And then there's an opportunity to enter into the actual community-centered work that is, I think, a foundation of equity. But there's some internal work to be done first. The last thing I'll say that I think just really builds on what Ebony was saying, as a white person, I was always taught that it's worse to say the wrong thing than it is to say nothing at all. And I think we really need to get to a place where there is that foundation of trust. Not that I'm not responsible for my own words and actions, but if I'm fearful of taking that first step, nothing's going to change. And so I need to be in a place where I can take that step, be responsible for the consequences if it's not the right step or if it doesn't go well. But otherwise, I am not actually making any progress around these issues.
Thanks for that. So hopefully the folks that are here are hearing some resonances with their own experience, and also getting some ideas of what things they might want to have in place as they're moving forward, especially if they're just beginning out on this journey. The survey results focused a lot on the challenges folks are facing, and I want to turn now to talk about the successes. And so I'm going to ask some questions of the folks here who are here from organizations, and I encourage participants, one, feel free to ask questions as we go along, and two, if you've had a success in your organization, if feel like you're doing something that's really worked, please share that in the chat and let others know about it. I think we can all benefit from this, from the collective mind here and the collective experience of the room. So I'm going to start with you, Aline, and just ask you to highlight some gains that you've made on this front with your organization.
Thanks, Andrew. I would say that, as I mentioned before, the very first piece was hiring the executive director, but also then moving into conversations, very real, raw, open conversations with the board around what it means to be a social justice organization that's centered on racial equity, and to make the tie between what food equity or gardening, food access has to do with racial equity. And so I think the conversations, the strategic sessions, all of that work is the foundation towards where we are right now. And even though we've been doing the work, I mean, you can't say it enough, even though we've been doing the work, we're not done or finished or a perfect example, or this is the only way you can do it. I think Ebony mentioned there's so many different frameworks out there and different folks who are doing the work in different ways. So I think that's a big part of it as well, kind of trying to sift through and figure out what fits best for the organization and the work that you're doing. And that can be overwhelming. That can be so overwhelming. So for us, making those choices of how we're going to move forward, who we're going to bring in. I think everything starts with looking very seriously at the personal, which is something else that Ebony hit on. Even though you're talking about a nonprofit organization and you're a staff member or a board member, you have to be doing the personal work too. You can't be talking about the professional work and not have done any work personally. So inviting board members and staff members to whether it's a training or something as simple as a book club. We have a social justice book club. It encourages people to do the personal work so that they can come to the professional work more authentically, in that sense of trust, in a sense where you have terminology and feel like you can actually talk about things. I think another thing is having, when you're bringing people on, when you're talking about hiring and board service, doing that in an equitable way. So CNE actually did a series of trainings in 2019, I think, equitable hiring practices or equitable HR. And so our HR team here, small team, a couple of people participated in that, and were able to bring back things that are central to how you even bring people into the organization, from what language you use when you put out a job position to onboarding people into the organization. So having those kind of resources so that as you bring new people in, you're doing it in an equitable way or through an equitable lens, I think that's huge, and something that as we try to change from a board that is mostly white to a board that mirrors the communities in which we're out and about, that making sure your language and your understanding and what you're putting out into the world as you're bringing people in is very important. So that's been a huge step for us as well. I think the idea of continuous capacity building is huge. You can't have racial equity or diversity, whatever it is, it can't be on the agenda one day. That's never going to work. It can't be one training. That's never going to work. It has to be built in to every single thing. You have to be talking about it all the time, and always recentering to how equity fits into your organizational goals. It has to be constant. So if that's, specific steering committee that is engaging people in the work, if that's having a consultant who's with you along the way to check in, whatever it is, it has to be ongoing. And I feel like our entire society, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit or education, we like to check the box. We like to say, we did a training 8 years ago. We did a training. It was awesome. We had the best person in, and so we've got this. That means nothing. You have to keep doing it, keep checking the box. And so we are always trying to grow, figure out how we can embed more of what we say we want to do or what we say we're doing. You have to do it, you have to embed it into every single thing. So I think that's really important as well. And then just, you have to keep checking in with the board. You bring new board members on, you bring new staff members on, you have to recenter. I think for us, having an executive director who's been here for a long time and who has led the work, having other people in the organization who've been here for 5 years, 7 years, you've been talking about it forever, and you've talked about it so much, sometimes you can forget that the newer people are new, and that they don't have the same experiences or framework. They haven't been through all of the trainings. So when you refer to, remember when we did the groundwater training, that you could have had the best training experience with some people who aren't there anymore, or the people who are there haven't had a chance to do it. So you have to keep doing it. It just has to be a constant. And so one of the things that I feel like is a major plus, obviously we're in this pandemic right now, and we're in this, journey of the civil rights movement and where we are right now on that journey, because we have this space where we talk about these things all the time already, it was very easy to integrate talking about COVID-19 and racial disparities, racial inequities. It's very easy to talk about, and when I say easy, I mean easier, I guess, to talk about where we are right now as far as civil rights, because we do have a framework and because we've made it clear that we're not going to be afraid to say the things and sometimes not say the things right, but have the conversations, because it's an ongoing piece of what we do. So that foundation is everything. It really shores up the organization for the long-term work, as well as those acute things that come in, like a COVID-19 pandemic, and what does race have to do with that? So I think those are some areas where we've made great progress, and where we can also continue to do more work.
Thanks, Elaine. Andrea, are there things from the Women's Initiative that stand out to you as major successes?
Certainly, a number of them. One of the things that we've done is really develop a partnership with the board, between board and staff. That's been incredibly key for us, sort of demystifying the board, having a board committee that is dedicated to the work, and partnering with a small group of staff has been sort of the first step in our successes. But also, we've made the work mandatory for staff. Our racial healing, our cultural humility initiative are required for employment at the agency. And that doesn't get immediate buy-in, no, but there's an immediate understanding as soon as it becomes a part of the day-to-day operations. So specifically where we found success is developing a small team to lead the work and to develop a learning plan. So for 2020, we are working through the Racial Healing Handbook together, and each month we complete a chapter individually. That's sort of the individual learning component to cultural humility and race work. And then monthly we meet with a partner who's around our learning level. So the conversation is one that sort of is comfortable from the start. And then we have monthly conversations across difference where we dive into our reflections of the reading across the entire group of us. And those conversations can sometimes be challenging, but I think where we've had the most success is our collective focus on leaning into the tough stuff. Not leaving it at that comfortable partner discussion, but really diving deeper into larger conversations across difference. And one of our biggest successes has been hiring a consultant. As you may have heard, Ebony is a consultant working with us. I've partnered with Ebony on a number of things, but what has been so key is we've been steeped in the work for some years, but we were so in it that we weren't able to really see our way out of it. We're really, frankly, stuck, just as Ebony mentioned. And so when she's able to come along and give that comprehensive point of view in that audit of what we've got, and that comparison that we can't really make with what other agencies are doing, that has advanced our work leaps and bounds in terms of developing an infrastructure that will be lasting in the work, and that's not going to be like, finger snapped and 2020 we did that, but really how are we going to carry this work forward, and how will our clients, when they step into our space, experience it from that first moment, that first engagement with us, not just in the clinical space, not just with our counselors, but what will their engagement look like when they meet with our client support specialists, our receptionists at the front desk? Just really thinking big picture stuff with Ebony around who are we, vendors, what vendors are we hiring? What support staff look like? And how do they engage in the work? How do our volunteers get up on that common language that we've now developed and feel comfortable with, how do we bring them along in the process? And so all of that, we've met with a ton of success, but mostly because we invested in that outside support to give us the boost that we needed to move forward.
Thanks for that. And Matthew, did you want to share some of the pieces that you're working on now with Virginia Humanities? Sure,
Andrew. Yeah, when Andrew sent me this question, it was, what big rocks are you working on moving forward right now? Which of course made me think of, Sisyphus, which is like pushing this rock up a hill only to watch it fall back to the ground. I'll get back to that analogy in a second. And of course you'd hear that from somebody from the humanities. But I also want to sort of step back a little bit in order to sort of talk about what we're doing now by giving you some context about where we've been, because I think that story is kind of important. And through that, I should certainly preface it by saying that, we've certainly had some successes, some tactical, some strategic successes with this work, but we've made a heck of a lot of mistakes, and I in particular have made a lot of mistakes. We hear a lot about, approaching this work with humility. Now, I'm not sure I really totally understood that at first when we were beginning to think about, the importance of inclusion and equity and working on it so deliberately internally. I'm not sure I totally understood that at first, but now I certainly have an appreciation for being humble and approaching with humility. So, when we first formed the Inclusion and Equity Committee that I referred to in my initial point, this was back in 2018, and this was all staff directed. None of whom actually who were on this committee, none of them actually had direct reports, and therefore didn't really have any of what we would think of as structural power within the organization. And early on, the committee had a lot of momentum and a lot of passion and ideas, but because I was on the committee, there was not executive leadership on the committee. It led to this huge communication gulf, and I think also a trust gap between what they were trying to work on and what they were met with when they came to me and the leadership team with their ideas. And then, I think out of that, there was a huge loss of motivation and morale. So I think, look at that as kind of a poster child of what not to do in this work. So last year, in the face of some challenges that resulted from this, we reconstituted the INE committee with members of the leadership team, including me and our chief financial officer. And we've been working really over the last year and a half, really rebuilding trust within that committee through what we're looking at as a shared leadership model, where tactically, where once a quarter we actually rotate the chair of that committee. Sometimes it's two people who are co-facilitators or co-chairs. Sometimes it's just one. But the agenda that's set is really, what are we trying to do as an organization moving forward? And we all came together around some goals for the organization that in order to be an organization that can successfully recruit for diversity, we have to be a place where our employees are actual assets and they can actually grow in this organization. So to do that, we need to create an environment to be able to talk openly and honestly about issues related to race, especially, our white colleagues and white folks, and then think about, how race equity issues, how do we stay current and relevant with issues related to culture and identity experienced by Virginians right now, and how that's changing over time. We need to value a growth mindset within the organization and allow for a lot of vulnerability and a lot of risk taking and a lot of failure, and not bring a lot of judgment to when we fail, but to actually try and learn from those mistakes and see how we can try to grow as we're talking and working and developing, I think a race equity mindset. In our programs in communication, sort of this external focus, we need to convey the very values that we're trying to build internally, so that we're not using othering language, and that we're conscious that we're trying to speak to everyone through and in our work and in our language. So today, some of those tactical and strategic, again, I'm not calling them successes because they're not done yet, but some of the work that we've been doing is Members of the Inclusion and Equity Committee and the leadership team, which includes, I guess I'm on both the Inclusion and Equity Committee and leadership team, but we also have the Chief Operating Officer and the Chief Information Officer. We've been facilitating staff-wide discussions using the characteristics of white supremacy culture that Serge has sort of extracted from a work called Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups. And through, basically there are a number of, they're an enumerated set of tenets that sort of describe aspects of white supremacy culture, things like paternalism, defensiveness, either or thinking. And we look at those either in small groups that are sort of similar to one another, or take one for an example. And then we also add readings that help to put those issues into larger context. And then we bring that, a week before we actually meet as a full staff, and we meet as a full staff twice every month. We use those readings to sort of facilitate a conversation that we break out into smaller Zoom groups to have deeper dives into those conversations with. Those have been, they started out really rough, I've got to admit. But I think over time, and what Aline says is about this idea of this is a constant process. This is not something you sort of begin and like you've done it once and it's like, all right, we're done. But I think it's almost like exercise, or it's like learning a language, especially I think for everybody, but really for a lot of the white folks in my organization. And it's that's where a lot of the work is having to be focused on right now. But through that exercise, you create an agility, and you create more of a comfort, even through discomfort, and being able to talk about issues honestly, openly, sometimes critically with one another. And by critically, I mean critiquing one another, and it's sort of what we're bringing to the table. And it's been, I would say it's been a really heartening process for us. And it's something that I didn't know what would happen when we went into it, but with the support of the Inclusion and Equity Committee, the support of my board, this has certainly been something has been something that's meaningful for us. From a tactical perspective, we're working on a pay equity model that's more transparent. And as an organization itself, a large portion of our revenue actually goes towards regranting to other cultural organizations across the Commonwealth. And so now we've gone through this huge assessment and implemented new grant guidelines and mechanisms to try to lower the barrier of entry to our grant giving, so that we can expand access to more funds to support the work of Virginia communities and nonprofit organizations, so that we're centering really the importance of ideas and not the ability of a nonprofit organization to be able to write a good grant, right? We want to actually support ideas, and that's sort of fundamental to who we are. But this assessment has allowed us to actually lower those barriers of entry to make our work reach broader audiences and needs. We're also trying to ensure that professional development is a component of every single staff member's job duties, so that there's a certain percentage of time that they're devoting to growing either within the position or within the organization, or their own sort of future growth. And now we're sort of now in the process, as we're ending this work of going through these characteristics of white supremacy culture. We're now looking at we've created an RFP, and we're getting in proposals for facilitators to sort of take us to the next sort of step in sort of evaluating where we are, looking at some data that was created with the Michigan Nonprofit Association for a racial equity audit that we did a year and a half ago, and sort of beginning to think about, all right, so what's next for us as we move through the next year? We've also thought, when hiring, requiring statements from each candidate that highlights their interpretation, understanding, experience, and commitment to the values of inclusion and equity, to make sure that they and I appreciate I think it was what Andrea said that about this idea of how do you onboard new staff, because that's a great point, that we're doing this work with the staff that's been there, and as new staff come in, we have to help them understand that this is a continual part of our culture that we're working on right now. And then I think more specifically, and this is a larger rock that we're trying to move forward, and this is an external kind of focused thing as well, is we're moving our headquarters to create what we're thinking of as a public humanities center at the Dairy Building in downtown Charlottesville. Right now we're at the Boar's Head, which is completely inaccessible. certainly has its own challenges as far as thinking about its history there. But obviously, we recognize coming to into the dairy building, it's an aspect of gentrifying the West Haven and 10th and Page neighborhood footprint. So how are we coming in to be trusted and good neighbors to the residents who actually live in that footprint? And how are we supporting the work that the residents there and the neighborhood organizations want to be doing in the area of cultural documentation and storytelling? So again, I mentioned this concept of rocks and pushing rocks forward. And I automatically thought of the myth of Sisyphus, which is like, you push this rock all the way up and this hill and it falls all the way back down. And you wake up the next morning and push it all the way up and it falls down again. I'm not thinking of this work as defeatist. This is not defeatist work. So it doesn't come back down, but there's no finish line. And I think, again, this goes to, I think back to what Aline said and others have talked about is this is a continual effort. And the more and more you work on it, the better you get and the more comfortable you get through the discomfort of talking with one another about it. And the better you imbibe and embrace the values that come through that work, so that what you're doing internally has, I think, a major impact on what you do externally as well. So again, there's not that finish line, but it's critical to being a leader in this particular environment, especially in the future of what we're trying to do as an organization. It's critical that we do this. So yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. And there was a really good question, and also I think a related comment that came up in the chat. The comment was from somebody at the Meditation Insight community, and they were mentioning the sort of groups where white staff board members come together to discuss race, and we heard some mention of that in some of our panelists' opening remarks. And there's this question from Raven, one of our participants, and she asks, "I'm curious, what's been the role of BIPOC staff in successful equity work, or what should organizations expect of them and their participation?" And I know that CNE right now is sort of grappling with that question about how do we have mostly white staff do this work and this internal work, personal work, in a way that is supportive of and helpful and inclusive of other people on the staff, and what's the right ways to support and involve people of color, Black staff members in this work. And I was just sort of curious from any of our panelists if you had some thoughts on that.
Sure, I can just say at the Women's Initiative, it's been incredibly important to us to have Black folks in the room, people of color in the room, when we are making decisions around next steps, but not to solely lead the work. It's not a heavy lift that's meant to be placed on our shoulders. The conversations are frankly made much more rich by having folks with varied backgrounds in the space in order to determine next steps. But I think before you can really begin the work, you have to be ready to dig deep and evaluate how you uphold systemic racism and white supremacy at your agency, because you do. And really being honest about that is the first step. And if you find yourself repeating, wow, we're an all-white group, or we're a mostly white group, what can you do to change that? Well, how can you bring in either consultants, community members? There are ways to diversify your group that don't necessarily include hiring if there's not, funds there to make that happen. But when it is time to hire, what do your hiring practices look like? So I think sometimes agencies may make the mistake of sort of getting stuck in that space of where, well, we're mostly white, so until we can, find that one person to lead us, we'll be right here. But you really can advance the work in a number of ways, regardless of what the space looks like.
I think from my perspective, the outside looking in, or just in general, so this country doesn't change if white folks don't change. And so I think we absolutely need that leadership. And it lights up my soul in a very good and exciting way when I see white folks really excited about racial equity. They've done their internal work, you know, they've done their reading and said, I can do this. I really want to be a leader and partner with Black, Indigenous, people of color in this journey. I think it's really important to ask folks if they're interested, right? Like you would ask anybody if they're interested in helping us pursue this. Don't presume that that's what they want to do. I think you have to not burden. So I think that's about ask. They may or may not be interested. They may or may not feel comfortable. They may or may not feel comfortable leading. You don't want to tokenize people, and you don't want to put an extra burden in what my colleague in academia calls the Black tax, right? So which means you have to do your work, just the work that you do in the world and at the organization, plus have you do the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, or other things that sort of representative of the organization for people of color. That is what you do not want to do. And I think that, I think in general, organizations have to be careful that I think DEI committees and task force are really, really good, and even having staff that's in charge of it are really good, but it could be a double-edged sword, which mean the organization doesn't take on the work. It's like those people are in charge of the work and everybody doesn't get on board. So I think that I don't think you necessarily, if you have a white organization or the folks of color at your organization are like, I want to participate like everybody else and not lead. I think I work with several organizations that their DEI committee is mostly white. They're committed to doing the work. They're committed to, changing their practices so the representation of their organization changes in the future. And so I think you could do the work. I think you just look for ways to partner with people of color that are interested in co-leading the work. I think it's also helpful to know that diversity does not mean equity, right? And so you can have an organization run by and have all people of color in and throughout. That doesn't mean they're actually doing equity work in the world, right? So because the systems and structures and mindset of white supremacy has pervaded all of us, right? So who can escape that? And so just because you have diversity does not mean equity if you're not intentionally doing the work, if you're not intentionally breaking down systems and structures and decoding yourself and your organization. That's the intentional work. We all should be doing that. Hopefully that will be partnered with people of color and you have greater diversity, inclusion, and equity at the end of the day, but you have to start somewhere. And if your organization is all white, you have to ask yourself, why is that in the first place? And how can we make that different? But if that's just representative of the community, but you're still interested in change, absolutely, you can do so many things, and there's so many learning and growth that you can be a part of. And there's so many organizations that you can partner with, right? Because you're like, oh, at the end of some conversation, you don't want to be having this conversation ad nauseum with yourselves with just a bunch of white folks, right? So at some level, you got to bring other folks in, but that should not preclude you from starting and to have leadership that is white and excited about it, because that's actually what you need, right? That they're excited, whether it's the ED, whether it's the board, whomever, and that will support your DEI staff, whether they're Black or white or Latinx, right? To have leadership that understand is on board and supportive, because if you don't have that, I don't care who's at the helm of your DEI initiative, it's not going to be sustainable.
Andrew, I just wanted to follow up. The points that Ebony made were spot on about you just have to ask people and then take their answer and run with that. If someone says, no, I don't want, I have too much on my plate, I don't have the capacity, or I'm not the expert. Yes, I'm a person of color, but I'm not really a trained equity expert, so I don't feel comfortable leading the charge or being the one who does a training. Take that, internalize it, and then keep doing the work. Sometimes people say, if a Black person, if a person of color is not interested in doing equity, well, then who can do the work? And you have to think about the fact that Black people didn't set the system up to be the way it is right now. So a lot of times folks say this is a Black issue or it's a person of color issue for them to change the way things are going. And that's completely on its head. We did not set the system up to work like this. So if white folks are not interested in changing the system, there is nothing that Black people can do to make it better. And that's, I think, a really hard truth for people as well. If we just could will it into being, we would have willed it into being by now. That's not how this works. So it's not that Black people aren't invested, that Black people might be tired, or people of color might be tired and overworked and overwhelmed. If someone says, no, I'm not ready for this, then you pick up the gauntlet even as a white person and say, okay, well, what can I do? And also, how can we make people feel supported in the work that they're already doing? So it's very important to ask. As Ebony said, people are interested and people are not interested. It could go either way. And then if someone says no, who's a person of color, you still have work to do as a white person, and as a white-led organization, get it done.
Thanks so much to all three of you for joining in there. I do want to take a break before we move into the larger question period, and I have one more question that I wanted to get through before that. Hopefully there's been a lot to think about so far, and I hope during the break the participants will take an opportunity to throw some more questions up in the chat. I have questions. I'm happy to ask them, but I am really curious what you all are interested to know. So moving forward, I wanted to come back to this question about working with outside help, with bringing in consultants and having a third party involved. And I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. Are there any specific aspects of the work that benefit more from having that third party involved? And is there ways that maybe organizations with limited resources can prioritize where they're bringing in outside help?
Yeah, so I think some of it actually builds on the conversation that folks were just having, that there's a great line, an important line, I think, from the disability rights movement that has been used more broadly, which is nothing about us without us. And when we think about what it means to do community-centered work, to do work that is grounded in principles of equity and inclusion and justice, it's really important for organizations to ensure that those who are most impacted by injustice are centered in whatever the resolution is. At the same time, I think, as folks named, it's important to not burden those with additional work if they're already experiencing injustice. And so at that point, I think for those of us who are white, it's important to consider, what is my responsibility and how do I make sure that I'm not engaging in sort of white saviorism, doing for rather than doing with. And all of that, I think, speaks to where an outside voice, a consultant, a partner, can bring in, I think, a perspective that doesn't unduly burden someone who's on the inside, or who can add a voice that maybe some folks who are so in it might not be able to notice an outside perspective. So at VCIC, we really work with organizations to think about 3 Ps, and that's been helpful. I appreciate kind of easy structures. So think about your pipelines, think about your programs, think about your policies. And when we explore pipelines, we're looking at, what is your outreach in terms of staff? What is your outreach in terms of board members, volunteers, interns, donors, all of the above, and to consider not just the onboarding, but also the retention, the culture, the climate. That really moves into your programs, which look at your workplace culture, whether there is a climate of belonging for clients, for employees, for board members, thinking about different stakeholder groups. That can include professional development, that could include employee resource groups. One of the things that we started this past June, based on some of the feedback that my colleagues, who were particularly Black women, were naming, is that we hired a counselor to specifically provide support for Black women employees, Black employees broadly, but primarily Black women were participating. VCIC paid for it. It was optional, but we recognize that there was additional burden being placed on employees who were doing this work and were feeling this work and living this work. And so that was an important step, and I would put that under the program bucket. And then around policies, you're looking certainly at your personnel policy manual, but that's also a place to evaluate things like your budget. I think budgets are moral and ethical documents. And if this is a priority and value, then that needs to be central in there. Otherwise, it's not a priority and value. And so I think an outside partner can help an organization maybe to prioritize within those 3 Ps. Where are you right now? Where are your opportunities for growth? And then an organization can say, we feel like we have a handle on updating our personnel policy manual maybe, but we need help with professional development. Or we think that we're really good internally in terms of our culture, but we are struggling to recruit board members that more accurately reflect the community, and so we need help with that. So those would be places, I think, to figure out where do you need assistance and support, and then who is the right partner based on your needs who might be able to help you grow in the ways that you've identified, but also maybe some ways that are your DKDKs, the things you don't even know that you don't know just yet.
Thanks, Jonathan. Ebony, was there anything that you wanted to add to that from your experience?
Yeah, so I think a number of things, right? So a lot of organizations I think, what did I write down? 1, 2, 3, 5. And this is all of the work I do. So a lot of organizations are trying to figure out their baseline, and they need somebody to come in and help them do an assessment, either of their policies and procedures or of their culture, and both, right? And so if you're trying to understand where we are, right, you don't know what you don't know, you're not sure where to go. So from the assessment standpoint, somebody outside coming in and kind of giving you a snapshot of yourself, which is, you can't fundamentally do that deeply just yourself. You probably need a third party to do that. Obviously training, there's some specific trainings, whether it's around language, whether it's just understanding or implicit bias or microaggressions, there's tons and tons that other folks just have the expertise to come in and do, even if you've done your own reading. So obviously training, if you need a facilitated dialogue to even broach these topics with your staff to see where people are. Obviously, we've had moments of crisis that are ongoing in our country where people just need space to breathe and to talk. And if you don't have the capacity to do that as someone in-house, it could actually blow up and wreak more havoc than you're prepared. So bringing somebody from the outside who's used to facilitating conversations and helping people debrief from various perspectives and process their emotions around these things can be really important and helpful, right? So you don't blow up something that you then don't have the capacity to put out, and you don't have the language for that. If you need some, if you're like Virginia Humanities who's done lots of work, or even the Women's Initiative, and you whoever's on your staff or leading this just needs an outside perspective, like coaching, and you're stuck and you're like, I just need somebody to consistently walk with me, that I can ask questions, have an outside perspective. We're going to be doing this work, but there's going to be moments of stuckness. That's kind of coaching. And then looking at it from a strategy perspective, right? So how do we operationalize, your goals around diversity, equity, inclusion? How do you create a roadmap for the growth and the change and the professional development and the change in the culture and policies and procedures that you want to take on in the future? How do you even get all that on the table, understand where you are and where you want to go? Obviously, having someone walk you through that process that's outside would be really, really helpful in any and all of those areas.
Thanks for that. I'm just gonna say thanks to the panel so far. I'd like to take a 5-minute break just to give people a chance to stretch and use the bathroom if they need to. It's tough to be on Zoom all day long. But let's come back in 5 minutes. And I just got a great question from one of our participants. Again, I have some questions here. If you have some questions, things you'd like panelists to dig into, throw those up in the chat now, and we will spend some time when we come back to look at those, and we'll see you in a little bit. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome back. There's another question here that follows up on the discussion we were having a minute ago, and it's one that I had been thinking about as well. So again, Raven's asking how have organizations been supporting, I think, Black staff, people of color who are working for organizations, helping to, I mean, maybe thinking in terms of that everyday Black tax, and then maybe in the specifics of our situation now. Aline, did you want to say something?
It's exactly what Jonathan and Ebony said for our organization. We had a consultant come in at the beginning of COVID. Actually, our executive director prioritized that, having a consultant who wasn't a therapist, but who could do some coaching and have conversations with people about what it means to work in a COVID world. And so that was available to us as early as March, because our executive director prioritized it immediately, and then brought that person back for available group and one-on-one sessions. So anyone could reach out, but that person also came to some of our full team meetings as tensions were really rising around civil rights over the summer. And it was a way for nobody on staff had to be responsible to like walk everyone through or comfort or shoulder what was going on. There was someone else who could come in and do that so that everybody could talk about it and express how they were feeling. And then starting all of our meetings with we have a COVID temperature check, which isn't an actual temperature check on your forehead. It's how are you doing right now in the midst of COVID? What's your temperature right now? And that's part of our meetings, that everyone on our staff gets to say, this is where I am, before we start talking about anything else. And it's been huge to giving people the sense to be able to say the scary things, I'm worried about this, and to join together as we're doing the same kind of work and share our experiences. So it's huge.
And I'll just say, Aline, that's such a great idea about the temperature check. And if you don't mind terribly, I think we might be doing over at the Women's Initiative. One thing that we've done to support Black staff in particular through this challenging time has been to really invest in time itself, offering more self-care time for Black staff. But our Black Staff Alliance, which met occasionally and had, participation was fair, we have been like a magnet toward one another in these recent months, and working with our executive director to give us more time to meet, to vent, to really go into those deep conversations that we can't otherwise have. But another thing that we have instituted in terms of optionality around COVID for all staff is the choice to show up for the first 15 minutes of our staff meetings, where sometimes we do go into what's going on right now in terms of social injustices, which can be triggering, right? So giving folks that opportunity to Zoom in when they're ready, and also just the permission, I guess, to opt out.
Yeah, I would say just from Virginia Humanities perspective, along the lines of what Andrew was just saying about that permission to opt out, take the self-care time you need, has certainly been something we've been reiterating for the past, 4 months, 5 months, however long it's been. We started actually with the temperature check initially with our full staff, and I think they got, our staff just got really exhausted from it, even just sort of talking about COVID and the effect on their lives, both Black and white staff. And so we sort of have moved away from that a little bit. We were implementing some other creative kinds of questions about, what have you learned through this period that sort of you didn't know about yourself, kinds of questions. But again, that was more staff wide and not necessarily focused on our Black staff. but you know, we have been very encouraging, and I know our staff is not always good about this, both black and white, is taking the actual, when you say you're taking time off, actually taking that time off. You know, don't, you know, put your phone down, put everything down the way you can. Just, you know, do that self-care that you really need to do. And I think more of our staff are beginning to do that. And I've reached out to staff individually just to sort of do that one-on-one engagement check, and just to sort of, you know, have a real conversation, recognizing, of course, that, you know, there still may be a trust issue between the executive director and that person, but trying to sort of bridge that trust factor through those more intimate and human conversations, and just being there to listen, really.
Some organizations I've worked with have had, you know, either point in time or ongoing racial affinity groups, and that is just conversation with whatever the identity group of that staff may be, or whether it's like a white affinity group or a black affinity group, particularly around moments of crisis and ongoing crisis, where so people can support one another and support their ongoing learning. And so what I like to say in my work is, like, folks of color and white folks are, there's a gap in our understanding and experience of racism, and our work is really to mine that gap. But sometimes to do it together can create more stress, because neither group feels like they can speak openly and honestly without offending one another or out of being burdened. And so sometimes you just can provide that space of, like, obviously you're a team, so you want to have spaces when you're coming together and talking about these things. But there might also be a space of, like, for your Black staff or for your Latinx staff, that people have particular responses to events or this ongoing trauma of what's occurring in our nation, or even just a racial equity work, and to have that space to process with people that look like you or have a similar experience can be helpful. So lots of organizations are kind of like tepid about it or afraid of it, but you could jump into that too, even in learning environments. And then, you know, for staff, particularly ones leading the racial equity work, I think having the coaching piece is really important. Andrea and I have worked together, and we mostly spend time helping her process not only her own work, but problem solving around issues that come up. And for anybody who has a coach, it's just helpful to have somebody to listen to you and to unburden, who's not associated with the particular situation at work. And so providing that support, and I love what Aileen, what happened at your organization, where y'all had groups and then you had individual, and thinking about that by way of support for your staff, I think it's really important.
I'd also say, I'd echo a lot of what everyone else said. Part of this is about building trust within your organization, not just in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. So if the only time my staff members know where I stand on race is in August 2017 after Charlottesville, in June 2020 after the killing of George Floyd, like, then they don't have a reason to trust that my work or my offerings are authentic. And so hopefully we've been able to build some trust over time through some of these efforts that are not just in the midst of a crisis or in rapid response. And then I think, assuming that that is there, how do you support your Black staff? Ask them. Like, it's not rocket science. Like, ask folks what they need and be ready to listen deeply and thoughtfully when they tell you, versus to get defensive or to rationalize or say, I can't do that, or those types of things. And also not always put it on folks. So to be able to say, here are a few things I'm thinking of. Would any of them be helpful in this moment? So it's not always on folks who are feeling, I think, the acute pain, the additional harm or pain, to have to come up with the solutions as well.
Thanks to all of you. I have another question that's come up that's also sort of about Black staff, about people of color. Oftentimes it's the case because of the demographics of the nonprofit sector, that there are single members of staff who are Black or people of color, so that they're sort of alone in that sense. And I'm sort of wondering, I mean, especially from from those of you who have lived experience of this, do you have any advice to other folks who are in that situation, and thinking about how maybe partly just to deal with that sense of isolation, and also to maybe help get other people connected to the issues and working towards change?
Just so I understand the question a bit more, are the folks the sole, like, is it their position to work on this? Or is it like, I'm the only person in my organization that currently cares about this now, and how do I get support? Is there?
I think it's closer to that second one.
Okay. All right. Let me think about it for a second.
That's going to be easier if what Jonathan said is true. If people know that there's trust and that it's ongoing trust. And sometimes it does take one of those crisis situations to bring up the questioning, you know, when an August 11th and 12th happens, or Breonna Taylor is murdered. You know, those are those acute things where it's in everyone's mind, or it should be. So it gives the impetus to talk about how you're feeling and what you need and what you want. But taking it further then to develop that sense of trust, so people can come and ask, not just in a crisis situation, so that you as a person of color feel comfortable talking to your supervisor or your coworkers and saying, you know what, this is what I need. I want a coach that I can talk to. I want time so that I can group, you know, find other people who are nonprofit leaders of color, and I want to meet with them. I want an hour every 2 weeks where I can do that, and being able to come and say, I want this, and the trust that someone will hear it and give you what you need and support you, and not have pushback, and not have not getting defensive about it. Well, why do you need an hour every 2 weeks to talk to other Black people? I need it. I just need it. I need to be with other people who are doing the same kind of work, or have the same kind of feeling of being the only one at my organization, or something like that. So the ongoing trust is important. But if you haven't developed it yet, and a crisis comes and that's your impetus, jump on it. Go ahead and jump on it, and then keep it going so it builds over time, so that people feel more comfortable to even ask you. Because there's definitely people who won't ask because they feel like they don't know where their supervisor or their peers stand, and they are afraid of getting shut down.
I think that several organizations that I know of, either by way of case study or worked specifically with, the change has come from the staff impetus, bringing it to leadership. And so I think that if the only thing, I operate off the notion, the only thing that somebody could say is no. So you can bring it up, and like you said, what's going on in our nation in crisis points can be the impetus for that. And so if you think that this is something that organizations should be talking about, taking on, learning about, I think that you should bring it up to your executive director or somebody, or probably them, executive director or leadership team, and say, you know, make your case, you know, do your homework, come in with, you know, case studies of, this is why this is important, this is why this is connected to our mission, this is important to the work that we do. Connecting to mission will be really important for an organization that's just like out to lunch, for lack of a better term. I think you can make the case, and then they can decide, and then, so you have to be strategic about things depending on your position at the organization, and depending on where the leadership is. But I encourage people that either come to my trainings I'm working with, is be strategically disruptive, right? Not disruptive like, I don't know, getting up in the room and screaming, but what in the ways you can push and ask questions and really call the organization to task and accountability around these issues, and connect it to the mission, but also what's going on in the community. If you're not really doing this work, not only you're missing the moment and the movement, but this is like where whole communities and organizations are going. So you're going to be, as an organization, left behind. And I think if someone brings that to the executive director, and I think the other thing that you have to do is not make this a separate body of work, but key to the ongoing work of the organization, right? So if an organization feels like, oh man, we have to take something else on, which is not germane to our central mission, they're not going to want to do it, right? Because most folks that work at nonprofits that I know are overworked and underpaid, right? But if you can think about how can we weave this into the way that we actually do all of our work, so it becomes like a pair of glasses, a set of lens that I put on to see clearly and to guide the work that we do. But I would say be disruptive when you can. If you have specific recommendations, take it to leadership. You can be an advocate. Folks can decide whether they're listening or not, but you can decide also to speak up and bring things up when it makes sense. Again, you have to be strategic about that depending on the position and the disposition of the organization.
Thanks everybody for weighing in on that. I have two questions that I think are important, and one I want to sort of flag because I want to make sure we get to it before we leave is the question of the relationship between the projects around racial equity and other forms of equity and other aspects of intersectional identities and those things. So let's flag that and come back to that in a minute, because I had another question that is specifically about race, but I think also will tie into these other things. And that was a question about, it's sort of a two-part question, and it's about white supremacy culture. And the question is, how can we identify and measure how white supremacy culture is being maintained within our organizations? So I know Matthew spoke a little bit about white supremacy culture. We've talked about a little bit of that at CNE. We've talked a little bit about organizational assessments. And I'm just wondering if there's someone on the panel that has some specific experience to speak to that.
I'll be honest. Within the humanities, when people often talk about measuring things in the humanities, we like look at them with a blank stare. Like, what are you talking about? It's about stories and it's about qualitative change. But I think thinking of a lot of it could be looking at one of the sort of readings we did when we were talking about, I think it was paternalism, and within sort of that structure of this tenets of white supremacy culture, was an article about this guy named John T. Edge, who's the founding director of the Southern Foodways Alliance. And there are folks who are calling for him to resign primarily because he's been a white gatekeeper of cultures of all kinds, right? And I think we look at the work that we do and we say, how are we being gatekeepers? Keeping people, determining who has access, who gets in, who gets amplified through the work that we do, and more importantly, how are we being white gatekeepers? And who, and because especially with most of the power being within the hands of white people within the organization. It's shifting now, but still that's the case. How are we appropriating other culture to sort of bring to the white gaze? And how do we think about when we do that? And who are our audiences? And I think questioning who your audiences are and how do your audiences transform over time through your programming is important. But I think just that question of, for me, that's been kind of critical is that white gatekeeping question. And how do we pivot from being a white gatekeeper to being an access provider and supporter of all culture and all sort of cultural documentation. But as far as measuring, I don't know. I would love to hear from others about thinking about how, quantitatively, how do we do that? I don't know. I'm not, I was never good at math anyway, but I just think that it's, I mean, for us, it's really, I think in the kinds of grants that we give, who are we giving our grants to, and what kinds of work are we supporting through those grants, for one. Who's also involved in our other programs. You look at the Festival of the Book. How are we making sure that we are providing access not to just to white audiences, but to all audiences, but to, you know, diverse voices across the sort of intellectual landscape of writing and thinking. So, there are certainly quantitative ways we can measure that. You know, we could say, well, we want to make sure that by 2025, 50% of our authors that are represented at the Virginia Festival of the Book come from, you know, either people of color or LGBTQ communities or intersections therein. And that could be certainly a way we could measure, you know, our effectiveness through our programs. But again, I tend to try to look at the sort of the more qualitative kind of components that are more important for me.
I have two thoughts on this. One is I do think that there are some ways that institutions could think about like look-fors or indicators that would be both internal as well as interpersonal that might help to think about how we do our work. So I think those would be co-created. We'd think about like, let's make sure as an organization that we're on a regular basis, individually and collectively thinking, whose voices are we not hearing from? Or are we rushing to a solution without coming out, you know, start to think about what are those specific behaviors, maybe patterns of things that we've done in the past, and then try to figure out and put front and center some of the behaviors that we want to build capacity. And maybe that's through doing some coaching or professional development. Maybe that's when you're in an office and not in a pandemic, having signs up about behaviors that you want to amplify, and those can be promoted. So I do think there are some ways. It's challenging, but I think there are ways to make some things explicit around behavioral practices that we want to promote. I also think that in some ways, the focus on like the prove it, measure it, like tell us what the outcome is going to be is in and of itself reinforcing. I mean, we have so much evidence of the ways in which organizations have engaged in discrimination and oppressive behaviors and institutionalized racism. And so if all we're doing is saying, we need just one more study, we need one more measure, we need one more, in some ways it's deflecting from actually addressing the core issue. I don't think that's the intent of the question, but I do think, certainly in my experience, I've seen that come up in working with institutions.
I think it's like both Jonathan and Matthew said, it's some of this cultural work is qualitative, a lot of it, right? I think you could literally go through the elements of white supremacy culture as an organization and name specifically how that shows up for your team by ways of how you all work together, policies and practices, and name those things, and then continue that be a continual conversation for your team. Are these things changing for us? You know, whether you do a survey that people do or whether it's an ongoing conversation about how to change those things. But I think you could read that whole document and kind of be overwhelmed. But I think it's the particularities of your specific organization. Like how does that show up for us, and what can we do to change that, right? So if you went through those elements and named those things and then said, well, what can we do to change that? And specifically, what does that look like in our meetings? What does that look like in our conversations with one another? What does that look like in our decision making? And tie those things not to the actions that you're currently doing and specific behavioral changes or policy changes in the organization. And it may be like we're practicing one thing all year till we get it right, or three things, right? But you've named it, you said this is the barrier, this is what specifically we're going to do to change that, the specific behavior we're going to encourage. And you can also tie that to performance evaluations and expectations of staff about what does it mean to embody these behaviors as a culture and have that be part of how do you embed that as part of both your conversation and the way you do work, as you would kind of anything else that you want to inculcate into your organization. So I think I take a practical, strategic view of anything. And so that's just my sort of practical view of thinking about do your own. It doesn't have to be some, I don't know, some tested analysis. You can look at these, diagnose yourself and come up with like, we're going to try to remove these barriers. And I'm a fan of prototyping, of like, let's try this. Let's see how it works. Let's evaluate. Do we need to shift a couple months? We're not doing it right. Do we need help? Do we need another resource? Do we need other ideas? And going from there. So don't be afraid to not take a step.
Andrew, I know we're getting close to the end of the time, but I just wanted to say an additional thing to add to what others have said is that as you're looking at some of the resources that people have put in the chat, or going through these conversations at your organization, the realization that our society is a white supremacist society is key. And that does not mean in any way, shape, or form that everyone is a white supremacist if you're white, or that your organization is, but because our whole society is, you operate and make your choices based on that. So even if you're a grassroots organization and you are personally working on eliminating, or even not grassroots, but you're working on eliminating it within your organization, there are other people that you have to interact with who are holding that white supremacist kind of hierarchy. And so choosing how you interact with other people as well, knowing that for us, let's say we have part of our program is schoolyard gardens. So we are a grassroots organization, but we are also operating within the school system. And the school system has its complicated history of racial inequity and a white supremacist kind of background or framework. So realizing that just because your organization isn't maybe following those same structural things that are rooted in that white supremacist kind of framework, that it's all around you. And so it's going to affect everything once you're aware of it and trying to look at different things. Like if you're a grant maker, the whole process of philanthropy is very much based on white supremacy. So all of those things hit us in different ways, and mostly we don't even think about it. We don't think about it. So sitting down, thinking about it, looking at everything within the organization, and then how the organization interacts with other people or the city or the school system or everything else, that's an important part as well to change internal and external.
Thanks. I have about 5 more minutes left for discussion, and I think this question about racial equity, which I think some people sort of cash as being particularly topical right now, which maybe is problematic, and obviously has a deep historical and social founding in America in particular. That's sort of been our focus so far, but I think that we've also sort of touched on the ways in which other aspects of people's identity position them within a culture that's not just racist but also sexist and also homophobic, and also provides advantages to able-bodied folks. So I'm sort of curious from panelists, and I think maybe to narrow the question a little bit, because I know we've had some interesting conversation at CNE about these different aspects of oppression and how they work together and how we want to talk about them and deal with them. So I'm curious, how have your organizations or organizations you've worked with sort of grappled with that question of in some sense, like which of these problems do we prioritize, or how do we put our language out that acknowledges those differences? Does anyone want to speak to that? It's a big one, I think, but.
It is a big one, but I'll say, at least at the Women's Initiative, we pulled staff. When we decided we were going to take this work on, yes, we want to do it all, but we really had to maintain a focus, and race was where we had the most challenges between staff in terms of just transparency and just frankly being comfortable engaging in conversations. We went to a group training a couple of years ago, a Ken Hardy training, and we went kind of like popping our shoulders like, okay, we're ready for this. We're ready for these conversations around race. We're in it. And we stalled. We found ourselves as a group to be really uncomfortable to get deeper. We were really stuck on the surface. And so identifying that and realizing that needed to be our focus for 2020, and not letting go of these other aspects around equity and inclusion, but just recognizing that we have to find a focus somewhere. And so it was really just staff-led.
That's helpful, thanks. Anybody else want to join in on it?
I think there's a big focus, obviously, on race, just from where we are in our development as a country and perhaps as a people. But and a lot of my work is focused on race. But one, I think you have to have a fundamental understanding of what we mean by diversity anyway. And so a lot of people think that just means race, right? So just expanding your understanding of what is meant by diverse, or like people are like diverse populations. Well, what does that mean, right? I actually like to get people to do the work of specifying who is their priority. I think that has everything to do with your constituency as well, right? And so a lot of folks want their board to be representative of the communities they serve. So what's the demographics of the communities you serve from a racial standpoint, from lots of different standpoints, from an income standpoint, experience, education, all of those things. I think you just kind of have to name those things, because we just say things and you say a word and everybody has our own definition of what that means, right? And so maybe just go through an exercise of, we want to take this on. What identities are important to us? What's reflective of the communities we serve? And then I think your fundamental understanding of inclusion is not just about race or ethnicity. It's providing a space where everybody will feel seen, heard, welcome. There will be voices at the table, particularly those identities that are marginalized, right? And so I think it's an exploration of that. And thirdly, when you're talking about equity work, most people start with race because it's the thing that everybody wants to avoid. So sometimes you can talk about gender. It's become, more, I guess, vogue or in the talk about sexual orientation too, and that was a faux pas or like a taboo a while ago. But people still don't want to talk about race. And so I always like to do in my work to say race intentionally, but not exclusively, right? So it's race and, right? Because all of these identities that people have intersect with other identities, right? What does it mean for me to be a Black woman that's now middle class, of a certain education, which may be completely different from somebody else's experience of that, or other intersecting identities. And so if you understand those three things of like, one, there's a broad definition of diversity, and let's explore that, and what might it mean to be a person of varying identities at this organization. Who are we missing? What's left out? Where's our blind spot? You should always be asking yourself, because if you get the race thing, but you miss the gender thing, or you miss the sexual orientation thing, that you don't have an inclusive environment and inclusive culture. And what lessons have you learned from tackling race that you can then apply to all of these other identities? And so I think fundamentally understanding those things and understanding your constituency enough so that it's representative of the communities you serve. But who said it? I think everybody on the panel, this is a journey, right? And so even our language around race in the LGBTQ community and and everything has changed drastically in the last 5 years. And then I'll stop, because somebody was asking me something about race, an organization that I used to be a part of maybe 6 or 7 years ago when I lived in Charlottesville. And they were like, we weren't talking about this. I said, 6 years ago, nobody was openly talking about white supremacy. That you would be a radical if you said that in any place that, you know, that wasn't, you would be seen radical. Now it's like, we're talking about it all the time. We're just throwing it out there. So these things change, and we should always be a student of how to make our country, our communities, and our organizations more inclusive. And so that's a continuous learning thing. I don't think we're ever going to get it right, but we should also always be asking who's on the margins, what perspective's not present, who might feel excluded in this work environment, and try to change that.
Thanks, Ebony. I'm going to throw the evaluation up in the chat so people can take a minute to do that. And I just saw Aline unmute. I just wanted to know if you wanted to add something to that.
I think that when you talk about some of the other areas of equity, there can be a lot of fear, especially if you're talking about the LGBT community. And sometimes the same thing happens with racial equity, although because of where we are as a nation right now, it's a little different. But people are scared of, am I going to offend my board? Am I going to offend funders if I start saying these things? If I start talking about pronouns or talk about intersectionality, if I talk about what it means to be a Black trans student, does that mean people won't donate to us anymore or won't be into our work? So that's a huge thing, is to confront that fear and look at why personally or professionally that fear is there, and what things you can do to overcome it and move forward and be a truly inclusive kind of organization and person, and, you know, everything that's going on. But fear is deeply rooted in change. So being able to acknowledge it, confront it, and then work through it.
Thanks for that. I think that point about fear and the related point about trust is something that runs through all of this work. So whether we're talking about race or gender or sexuality, or just creating an environment where people who need to be there feel okay being there and sharing themselves as human beings, then trust is really the key to that. And it's maybe back to Ebony's point, it's important to be intentional about all those aspects of oppression, but I think that trust, because just talking about trust without talking about race or gender or sexuality is a problem, but coming back to that in some way. So there was a question that came along at some point about how we measure trust. And there is, I think, ways to do that as well. And so in the follow-up, I'm going to include some information on psychological safety in the workplace, which I think is helpful in a really broad way to this topic. But there's a lot of other things that have come up that I'm going to share. And I just wanted to run through a quick list to let you know that you can expect these in an email. So the evaluation form is there. Hopefully you're taking a minute to fill that out. I'm going to follow up with the document from the Annie Casey Foundation that we based that survey on, the Awake to Woke to Work document that Ebony is going to be focusing on in her upcoming training on December 3rd. And I'll have a link to that training so you can sign up for it as well in that follow-up email. The Racial Healing Handbook that got mentioned, I'll include. There was a document on white supremacy culture that got shared. And then we have a list of sort of resources related to diversity, equity, inclusion on our website that we've cultivated and recently updated. So it's really helpful for digging in some other questions. I had a question about board's role, and we're going to be having a training coming up about that I'll let you know about as that develops. It should be launching in early 2021. And on that resource list includes a list of organizational assessments. So if you're interested in looking at some of those things. So I hope that the one takeaway that everyone has from this is that that we're just the beginning, right? That we're just scratching the surface, that there's a lot of work to do and a lot of areas that work needs to be done in. And so it's a slow and steady kind of progress. And hopefully the resources we've shared, the conversation we've had, the consultants, the colleagues you've been able to connect with can help you on your journey as we move forward. The other thing that I'll mention that that CNE is doing that's relevant and important is our annual Philanthropy Day is coming up on November 15th, and I would invite all of you to come to that. And I'll include a link to that. But our focus for Philanthropy Day this year is the question, what will it take to create a more just community? So obviously very relevant to the conversation we're having. And similar to this format, we're going to have a panel discussion with 3 Black women who are familiar with the Charlottesville community, with these questions of racial justice. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that, which I'm sure will be another great way to engage in some of these topics and thinking. So once again, a huge thank you to all of our panelists for coming and giving of yourselves today. And thanks to everyone who joined, and we'll share a recording of the video in that follow-up email. Thanks so much.